Shaquille O'Neal stepped into La Lumiere, a luxurious restaurant nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills. Dressed in casual, slightly wrinkled clothes, he looked as though he had just come from a regular day rather than preparing to dine in one of the most exclusive establishments in the city. Choosing a discreet table near the edge of the dining floor, Shaq hoped to enjoy his evening without attracting attention. The light from the crystal chandeliers above sparkled across the room, casting an ethereal glow on the elegant patrons seated nearby. The restaurant, known for its opulent ambiance and gourmet menu, was bustling with patrons dressed to the nines. From designer silk gowns to impeccably tailored suits, the clientele exuded wealth and sophistication. Shaq's gray t-shirt, sweatpants, and well-worn sneakers stood out in stark contrast. Despite his fame, he didn't act the part of a celebrity tonight, choosing instead to keep a low profile. However, his attempt at blending in failed almost immediately. Before he could even glance at the menu, a waitress approached his table. Her name was Emma, and she was one of La Lumiere's most seasoned servers. Clad in a pristine uniform with her hair tied neatly in a bun, Emma projected an air of professionalism that many patrons mistook for warmth. But those who worked with her knew better. Emma prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity of the restaurant and often judged customers based on their appearance. Emma's sharp eyes swept over Shaq, lingering on his sneakers and casual outfit. Her lips curled into a sneer as she leaned in slightly, her voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you can afford to dine here?" she asked loudly enough for nearby patrons to overhear. The tone of her voice and the insinuation in her words turned several heads. Shaq's eyes met hers, unflinching. Instead of reacting with anger or embarrassment, he offered a calm, measured smile. The tension in the air grew palpable as diners nearby paused their conversations to witness the unfolding scene. What would happen next would leave everyone in the restaurant stunned and reveal a truth that none of them had expected. Beverly Hills, a city synonymous with glamour and wealth, was alive with its usual nighttime allure. Sleek sports cars lined the streets, their polished exteriors glinting under the warm glow of streetlights. The city's elite strolled through the avenues, their footsteps echoing on cobblestone sidewalks. Among the city's many jewels, La Lumiere shone brightest. Known not just as a restaurant but as an experience, it was a destination reserved for the affluent and influential. Tonight, the restaurant's glass doors opened gently, revealing a towering figure whose entrance instantly captured the room's attention. Shaquille O'Neal, standing over 7 feet tall, moved with a deliberate, almost regal pace. His casual attire contrasted sharply with the extravagance around him, yet his presence was commanding enough to silence any murmurs of doubt or judgment, at least momentarily. Diners near the entrance stole curious glances, many of them recognizing the NBA legend. However, recognition soon gave way to whispers. Amid the polished marble floors, velvet drapes, and gilded furniture of La Lumiere, Shaq's simplicity seemed almost jarring. Some patrons exchanged amused smiles, their eyes betraying a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Emma stood at the reception desk, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood. Years of working at La Lumiere had given her a certain confidence. She considered herself more than a waitress, a guardian of the restaurant's prestige. When Shaq approached her desk, her smile remained polite, but her eyes betrayed her thoughts. As he greeted her with a warm, "Good evening," Emma's gaze flicked down to his sneakers, then back up to his face. Though she recognized him, she couldn't reconcile his casual demeanor with the elegance La Lumiere demanded. "This is a fine dining establishment," she said, her tone measured but dripping with implied superiority. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Shaq's expression remained unbothered. "Yes, I'd like to try dining here," he replied, his voice calm and composed. Emma hesitated, caught off guard by his poise. She offered a curt nod before turning to check for table availability. When Emma returned, her professional smile was intact, but a glint of mischief shone in her eyes. "Follow me," she said, gesturing toward the dining floor. Instead of leading Shaq to one of the prime tables bathed in soft light, she guided him to a dimly lit corner near the kitchen. The clatter of dishes and the faint aroma of food lingered in the air. "This spot should suit you perfectly," she said, placing the menu on the table with a pointed thud. Her tone was loud enough to attract the attention of nearby diners. Some watched with amused curiosity, others looked on with quiet disapproval. A young woman at a nearby table whispered to her companion, "That was unnecessary. He didn't do anything to deserve that." Shaq, unbothered by the spectacle, took his seat. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. While Emma walked away, clearly expecting him to leave in embarrassment, Shaq remained composed. He opened the menu, his smile unwavering. Across the room, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, observed the interaction with interest. Mr. Carter, a distinguished man with silver hair, murmured to his wife, "He's handling this remarkably well." Most people would have made a scene by now. As the evening progressed, Shaq's quiet presence began to draw more attention. Patrons who had initially dismissed him now watched with a mix of curiosity and admiration. His confidence, unaffected by Emma's condescension, was captivating. It wasn't long before whispers of recognition began to ripple through the restaurant. A manager, alerted by the growing buzz, approached Shaq's table. Unlike Emma, he greeted Shaq with genuine warmth and respect. "Mr. O'Neill, it's an honor to have you here," he said, extending a hand. Emma, standing nearby, paled as she realized her mistake. The manager continued, "Please allow us to move you to a more comfortable table." Shaq glanced at Emma, his expression unreadable. Then, with characteristic humility, he said, "Thank you, but I'm fine here." His words, spoken with grace, carried an undeniable weight. The room fell silent for a moment before the buzz resumed, now tinged with admiration for the man who had handled the situation with such dignity. By the end of the night, Shaq's unassuming presence had left a lasting impression on everyone in the restaurant. Emma's earlier arrogance seemed petty and misplaced in hindsight. The diners who had initially judged him by his attire now recognized the depth of his character. As Shaq prepared to leave, he called for the bill. To Emma's shock, he not only paid for his meal but also left a generous tip, one that exceeded the cost of his dinner several times over. As he walked out of La Lumiere, the room seemed to hold its collective breath, aware that they had witnessed more than just a dining experience. Shaquille O'Neal had shown them that true class isn't about appearances or wealth. Shaq sat at the elegant table in La Lumiere, the city's most opulent restaurant, with an air of calm detachment. The setting exuded sophistication, a symphony of candlelight, soft music, and the muted hum of whispered conversations. However, the atmosphere around him seemed to tremble under a different kind of tension. Emma, the sharp-tongued waitress, stood poised beside him, her demeanor a perfect blend of condescension and forced politeness. Her well-manicured fingers drummed lightly against her order pad as she awaited his choice. Any trace of discomfort or hesitation, she mused inwardly, fully expecting this casually dressed man to falter in such a high-class establishment. Shaq, steady as a rock against a gentle wave, remained unshaken. He looked up, his dark eyes carrying a hint of amusement that danced at the edges of his calm demeanor. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, his voice steady, the tone calm, as though he were ordering the simplest dish on a roadside cafe's menu. Emma's smile faltered for the briefest of moments. She hadn't anticipated him picking the priciest item on the menu so nonchalantly. Quickly recovering, she let out a laugh, loud, derisive, and calculated to draw attention. Heads turned subtly at the surrounding tables, diners momentarily pausing their conversations to glance over. "Oh, really?" Emma's voice dripped with syrupy sweetness but was laced with unmistakable scorn. "I hope you know how to appreciate it. This isn't the kind of food everyone is accustomed to." Her words hovered in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire, toxic and lingering. Nearby, a young couple whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the unfolding scene. "She's so rude. Why would she talk to a customer like that?" The woman's disapproval was clear, her brows furrowed. The man beside her shook his head. "She probably thinks he can't afford it." Emma remained at Shaq's table, seemingly indifferent to the murmurs of disapproval. Her hand rested on the edge of the table, her posture exuding a kind of haughty superiority. She waited, expecting a reaction that would affirm her preconceptions. But Shaq simply smiled, his expression composed and his eyes warm. "Thank you for the suggestion. I'm looking forward to trying it," he said, his polite tone betraying not a hint of irritation. Emma's smirk wavered ever so slightly, unsettled by his unyielding calmness. To her, this tall man in casual sportswear and worn sneakers couldn't possibly grasp the true value of such a luxurious dish. Yet, without realizing it, her own demeanor had betrayed her, her pettiness and lack of professionalism laid bare for anyone paying attention. As she turned away, Emma raised her voice deliberately, her words aimed at a nearby colleague but loud enough to carry across the room. "Filet mignon Rossini. He probably doesn't even know what he's ordering. People like that usually pick expensive items just to look fancy. But wait till the check comes, I bet he'll leave right away." Though seated, Shaq could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze. Some diners looked at him with sympathy, others watched with quiet curiosity. Yet he showed no signs of embarrassment or discomfort. Instead, he calmly opened the menu, skimming through the other dishes with genuine interest, as if this was simply another culinary adventure. At the service counter, Emma continued to keep an eye on him, her irritation evident in the tight lines of her face. She felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, believing she had asserted her superiority over someone she deemed out of place. Her sharp words, however, hadn't gone unnoticed. From a corner table, Mr. Carter, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair, observed the scene intently. Turning to his wife, he murmured, "He's testing everyone's patience here." "It's intriguing." The restaurant's hum quieted, the tension beneath the surface now palpable. It was as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for a spark to ignite. Shaq, still calm and unflappable, seemed not only to savor the experience but also to prepare for something greater, something neither Emma nor the restaurant could anticipate. Emma, unaware of the growing disapproval around her, decided to escalate her disdain. She strode back to the service counter, leaned in, and whispered loudly to her colleague Jake. "He'll leave as soon as he sees the bill. People like him just pretend to be fancy. Look at this," He ordered the most expensive dish and doesn't even seem to know what he's doing. I bet he won't even make it to dessert. Jake, a young man with a kind face, looked uneasy. He glanced briefly at Shaq, still seated in the far corner, calm as a mountain amidst the curious stares. In a low voice, he replied, "Maybe he's just here to enjoy the experience, Emma. Who knows? He might have his reasons for coming here." Emma scoffed, shaking her head. "Reasons? Look at his outfit. Who comes to this restaurant in worn-out shoes if not to pretend?" Jake avoided her gaze, unwilling to argue. He felt uncomfortable with her behavior but knew that opposing her would only fuel her arrogance. At the corner table, Shaq sat quietly, entirely unbothered by the murmurs behind him. He flipped through the menu leisurely, savoring every moment of the luxurious ambiance. Occasionally, curious glances came his way, but he met them with a gentle, untroubled smile. At a neighboring table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter continued their quiet observation. Mr. Carter slowly raised his wine glass, his eyes gleaming with understanding, as though he had witnessed countless similar stories. He lifted the glass slightly, giving a subtle nod toward Shaq, a small but meaningful gesture. Shaq caught his gaze and returned the nod with a smile, his eyes conveying a silent message, "I'm fine." "Thank you." Mrs. Carter leaned closer to her husband, whispering, "It's strange how they're treating someone like that. Who do you think he is?" Mr. Carter set his glass down, his eyes still on Shaq. "There's something special about him. That calmness, it's not something everyone has." Across the room, Emma's voice grew louder, her mocking tone drawing more attention. "See, he didn't even have a reservation. People like him just want to see if they can sneak in unnoticed. But I guarantee he'll bolt the moment he sees the total on the bill." A few diners exchanged glances, their disapproval clear. At another table, Lisa, a young businesswoman dining with a friend, frowned. "She's being so rude. He hasn't done anything to deserve that." Her companion, a composed young man, nodded. "It seems like his very existence annoys her." The restaurant's atmosphere shifted, no longer tranquil. Emma's pointed remarks and Shaq's unshakable calm created an underlying tension that rippled through the room. Meanwhile, Shaq remained unbothered. Though aware of the judgment surrounding him, he felt no need to justify himself. He sat back, his large hands resting lightly on the table, his demeanor one of quiet confidence. At the Carters' table, Mr. Carter sighed softly. "The world is a strange place," he said, his voice warm but tinged with disappointment. "People forget that someone's true worth isn't in their appearance." Mrs. Carter nodded, her expression thoughtful. But both knew the evening's drama was far from over. Emma might think she controlled the situation, but it was clear to those observing that Shaq's mere presence commanded the atmosphere. Emma, fueled by her misplaced pride, decided to take things further. Ignoring Shaq entirely, she grabbed her notebook and began attending to other tables with exaggerated enthusiasm. As she passed his table, the mocking smile on her lips was unmistakable. But Shaq, unshaken, continued to watch, a quiet strength radiating from him that no amount of disdain could diminish. The restaurant brimmed with an air of quiet sophistication. The soft glow of ornate chandeliers cast a golden hue over the room, illuminating the polished wooden tables and meticulously arranged centerpieces. A small jazz band played in the far corner, their mellow tunes weaving a soothing atmosphere that seemed to slow time itself. The murmur of diners' conversations blended seamlessly with the music, creating a serene yet lively ambiance. As the jazz number ended, the room filled with polite applause. Among the diners, one stood out, Shaw. His clapping was warm and resonant, carrying a depth that brought genuine smiles to the band members' faces. His appreciation wasn't overdone, but it had a sincerity that made others notice. Around him, curious glances began to emerge, and whispers spread among nearby tables. "Who is he?" a woman at one table asked her partner. "No idea," came the reply. "But there's something about him, calm, composed." Shaw's presence radiated a quiet strength, a trait that was all the more striking in contrast to the growing tension that was brewing at the restaurant counter. Behind the counter, Emma, one of the restaurant's senior servers, was far less composed. Her usually polite smile had faded, replaced by a tight frown. She stole glances at Shaw, her irritation growing with each passing moment. "What's his deal?" she thought bitterly, biting her lip. Not a single complaint. No demands. Just sitting there like he owns the place. Shaw's unshakable calm unnerved her. She had expected him to protest, to demand attention, but he remained silent, his demeanor almost daring her to escalate the situation further. Determined to test his patience, Emma decided to delay his service even more. Spotting a group of diners who had just arrived, she approached their table with an exaggerated enthusiasm. "Good evening. Welcome to La Lumiere. Let me walk you through our menu," she began, launching into an unnecessarily detailed explanation of the dishes. Her voice was deliberately loud, a performance meant to show Shaw that he wasn't her priority. At a table nearby, Mr. and Mrs. Carter exchanged uneasy glances. Both had been observing Emma's behavior since Shaw arrived, and their discomfort was evident. "She's giving him a hard time on purpose," Mrs. Carter whispered, her voice tinged with indignation. "He's been sitting there for at least 20 minutes. Mr. Carter took a slow sip of his wine, his sharp eyes fixed on Emma. "I see it," he said, his tone measured. "But what intrigues me is how calm he is. It's as if he's waiting, not for the food, but for something else." Across the room, Lisa, a young entrepreneur seated with a colleague, couldn't hide her disapproval. She set down her wine glass with a sharp clink. "She's awful," Lisa said, her voice low but firm. "I don't understand why this place keeps someone like her on staff." Her companion nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But look at him," he said, gesturing toward Shaw. "He doesn't need anyone to stand up for him. He knows exactly what he's doing." Emma's irritation reached a boiling point. As she passed Shaw's table, she deliberately turned her back and spoke loudly to a colleague within earshot of several diners. "Sometimes, I think certain people don't understand that not everyone belongs here," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "It's amusing to watch how hard they try to fit in." The veiled insult didn't go unnoticed. A ripple of disapproval spread through the room as diners began to murmur among themselves. "That's uncalled for," Lisa muttered, her hands tightening around her napkin. "Someone needs to put her in her place." At another table, an elderly woman, Mrs. Hamilton, leaned toward her bright-eyed granddaughter. "This is disgraceful," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Staff are here to serve, not judge. That young woman is digging her own grave." Through it all, Shaw remained composed. He occasionally glanced at the paintings on the walls or the sparkling chandelier overhead, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Emma's growing hostility. As Emma passed by his table again, she avoided his gaze but couldn't resist another jab. "This is why we need higher standards," she said to a colleague. "Not everyone understands the sophistication required to dine here." Shah met her words with silence. Instead of reacting, he offered a faint smile, his gaze steady and unbothered. His lack of response wasn't out of weakness but a quiet confidence that made Emma's actions seem all the more petty. The tension in the room reached a tipping point when Emma finally approached Shah's table. She carried a silver tray holding the filet mignon ricini he had ordered, a signature dish priced at $350. Her movements were deliberate, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor as she approached. Placing the plate on the table with slightly more force than necessary, she straightened and looked down at Shah with a forced smile. "Your order," she said curtly, before turning on her heel and walking away without another word. The faint clink of the plate meeting the table reverberated through the room, drawing the attention of nearly every diner. Before Shah could even lift his fork, Mr. Carter stood up. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I'd like to speak to the manager." Emma froze, her smug expression faltering as the room turned its gaze on her. Moments later, the manager appeared, his face a mask of professionalism. "Is there a problem?" he asked, addressing Mr. Carter. "There is, Mr. Carter replied, gesturing toward Emma. "Her behavior has been unacceptable. She's been rude and unprofessional, and it's clear she's targeting that gentleman." The manager's expression darkened as he turned to Emma. "Is this true?" he asked. Emma stammered, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the diner's stares. I didn't mean." Shah finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "It's all right," he said, addressing the manager. "She's already shown who she is. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." But the damage was done. The diners began clapping, not for Emma's dismissal but in support of Shah's grace and composure. As the tension dissipated, the diners returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had shifted. Emma was escorted to the back office, and the manager personally apologized to Shah, offering to waive the bill. Shah declined. "Thank you," he said with a small smile, "but I'd rather pay for my meal. Integrity is worth more than a free dinner." His words left a lasting impression on everyone present. By the time Shah left the restaurant, he had become the unspoken hero of the evening, a man whose quiet strength had exposed the flaws in another's character without ever raising his voice. The air in the restaurant was thick with sophistication and an underlying tension that only Emma seemed to feel. She approached the table with a practiced grace, her movements deliberate yet laced with a hint of disdain. Her cold, challenging smile barely masked her intentions as she placed the intricately presented dish before Shah, the quiet diner seated inconspicuously in the corner. "This is what you ordered," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient murmur of the dining room. "I hope you can appreciate it." Her tone was polite, yet the challenge lingered like a subtle undertone in a melody meant to unsettle. Shah looked up from the dish, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Emma's barely concealed antagonism. His dark eyes reflected warmth and composure, a man seemingly unfazed by the subtle hostility directed his way. "It looks delicious," he said, his voice steady and courteous. "Thank you." Emma's expression faltered for a moment, her expectations of discomfort or irritation unmet. Not one to back down, she leaned in slightly, her smile turning sharper, her voice low enough to carry only to his ears. "This dish is for connoisseurs," she said, her words laced with an edge of bitterness. "I'm guessing it's your first time." Shah met her gaze, unblinking, his faint smile never wavering. "Thank you for the advice," he replied, his tone so even and unbothered that it left Emma momentarily off balance. Around the room, nearby diners watched the exchange with growing unease. Lisa, seated at a nearby table with a friend, leaned closer to whisper, her voice carrying a note of indignation. He just politely thanked her, and she's still being sarcastic. Unbelievable. Her friend nodded, her eyes fixed on Shaw. She's trying to provoke him, but I think she picked the wrong target. At the center table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter observed the scene with quiet intensity. Mr. Carter lifted his wine glass, his expression serious as he watched Emma's every move. She has no idea who she's dealing with, he murmured to his wife. A man like that doesn't need to say or do anything. She'll end up embarrassing herself. Emma straightened, scanning Shaw's face for any sign of discomfort or irritation. Finding none, a faint sense of defeat crept into her composure. To mask it, she threw out another remark, her tone smug. If this doesn't suit your taste, we always have simpler options. Feel free to order if needed. Shaw's steady smile remained unbroken. Thank you. I'll consider it, he said with a light nod. His calmness, instead of soothing Emma, only seemed to heighten her frustration. She clenched the notebook in her hand tightly and turned on her heel, retreating to the counter. Slamming the silver tray down with a force that startled her colleague, "Jake," she hissed under her breath. "He's just pretending to be polite. I'm sure he doesn't even know what he just ordered. People like that only come here for attention." Jake's disapproval was evident as he regarded her. Maybe he just wants a peaceful dinner. Isn't it our job to serve everyone? Emma spun around, her eyes filled with disdain. Can't you see, Jake? He doesn't belong here. I bet he'll leave as soon as he sees the bill. Meanwhile, Shaw began to savor the filet mignon Rossini before him. The tender slices of beef, paired with foie gras and a truffle sauce, were a masterpiece of flavor and presentation. He chewed slowly, his serene expression unchanging as the murmurs of the other diners grew louder. Some expressed indignation on his behalf, while others glanced at Emma with disapproving eyes. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted, the elegance marred by an undercurrent of tension. Shaw's table, once inconspicuous, became the center of attention. Yet he did nothing but eat his meal gracefully, as if orchestrating the scene around him. Emma's earlier confidence began to wane as she felt the weight of the judgmental stares. Just then, the restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, emerged from the reception desk. His polished appearance and swift stride drew attention as he made his way to Shaw's table, his face marked with visible concern. The ambient murmur ceased, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Reaching the table, Mr. Thompson gave a slight bow. His voice was low, yet full of respect. "Shaq, it's such an honor to have you here. I apologize for the delay, we had no idea you were coming today." The words shattered the room's equilibrium like a lightning bolt. Diners who had been merely curious now stared in disbelief, their expressions a mix of astonishment and recognition. Emma, still gripping the tray, froze in place. The name reverberated in her mind, shattering her earlier confidence. Shaq. Did he just call him Shaq? She thought, her mind racing to piece together the reality she had refused to see. Around her, the whispers began, rippling through the restaurant. "That's Shaquille O'Neal," a young couple murmured. "The basketball legend. He owns stakes in so many businesses. And he's a renowned philanthropist," another added. Emma's heart sank as she realized the enormity of her mistake. All eyes turned toward her, their expressions laced with silent judgment. The smug confidence she had worn earlier crumbled, replaced by a rising panic. Mr. Thompson's gaze flicked toward Emma, sharp and stern. His displeasure was palpable. Shaw, still seated, picked up his glass of water and looked directly at her. His gaze wasn't angry, but it was piercing, commanding her attention and making her wish she could disappear. Shaw's calm voice broke the silence. "You don't need to worry. Everything's fine. But perhaps I'd like to have a brief chat with your team after dinner." Mr. Thompson nodded immediately, his expression resolute. "Of course, Shaq. I'll arrange it right away." Emma's face paled, her trembling hands clutching the tray as though it could ground her. The room's tension thickened, every gaze a silent condemnation. What she had envisioned as a triumphant moment to humble and unruly guest had become a lesson she would never forget. And as Shaw resumed his quiet meal, Emma realized she had not humbled anyone but herself. Emma had always taken pride in her work. She believed herself to be one of the most dedicated servers at La Lumiere, a prestigious restaurant known for its exclusivity and impeccable service. Tonight, however, that confidence seemed to shatter like a delicate piece of glass slipping from her hands. The evening had started like any other busy night. The soft hum of conversation filled the restaurant, blending with the gentle clinking of cutlery and the faint notes of a live pianist in the corner. Emma moved between tables with practiced grace, her tray balanced perfectly in her hand, her smile as polished as the crystal chandeliers above. Yet, when the man in the simple gray suit entered, she barely noticed him. He didn't fit the profile of the typical La Lumiere guest. No designer labels, no entourage, no air of self-importance. She had dismissed him almost immediately. But now, as she stood frozen in the middle of the dining room, every eye on her, she realized the gravity of her mistake. The man in the gray suit wasn't just any guest, he was Shaq El-Amin, one of the co-founders of La Lumiere and a figure of quiet yet formidable authority. He had come unannounced, his presence a surprise even to the management. Emma's curt tone and dismissive attitude toward him had not gone unnoticed, and now, she felt as though the weight of the entire restaurant had shifted onto her shoulders. The murmurs of patrons buzzed around her like an invisible swarm. Emma's chest tightened as if the very air in the room had been sucked out. She tried to muster a response, but her throat seemed to close, leaving her stranded in silence. Shaq's gaze was steady, his dark eyes carrying no visible anger, but their sternness was undeniable. He set his glass of water down gently, the soft clink echoing louder than it should have in the hushed room. "Miss Emma," he began, his voice calm yet commanding, "what do you think about how customers should be treated?" Emma opened her mouth, but no words came. Her mind raced, fragments of sentences forming and dissolving before they could escape her lips. I didn't know who you were," she finally stammered, her voice barely audible. Shaq shook his head slightly, his expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. "You don't need to know who I am to show me respect," he said. His words were measured, each syllable cutting through the tension in the room like a scalpel. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Some patrons nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of Shaq's words hung heavy in the air, not just for Emma but for everyone present. Emma's legs felt unsteady, and she gripped the edge of her tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to disappear, to undo the events of the evening, but there was no escape. "But you're not like other customers," she whispered finally, her voice trembling. Shaq leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "It's precisely because I'm not like other customers that you need to learn to treat everyone the same," he replied. Respect isn't something you reserve for people based on how they dress, how they speak, or how they look. It's the most basic thing that every person deserves. Emma's head lowered further, shame and regret washing over her. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, their silent judgment adding to the weight of her guilt. From a nearby table, Mr. Carter, a regular, whispered to his wife, "He doesn't need to raise his voice. What he's saying is more than enough to teach her a lesson." Lisa, another diner seated nearby, raised her glass of wine but didn't drink. Her gaze rested on Emma, a mixture of disappointment and hope in her expression. "She'll probably remember this for the rest of her life," Lisa murmured. "I just hope she truly changes." The restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, stepped forward hesitantly. His voice was firm but not unkind as he addressed Emma. "We need to have a talk after your shift," he said. "But first, let me handle this situation." Emma nodded faintly, unable to meet his eyes. She stepped back, her face flushed with shame and her heart pounding in her chest. Shaq watched her retreat, his expression softening slightly. Turning to Mr. Thompson, he spoke in a quieter tone. "There's no need to make this a bigger issue than it is," he said. "Everyone can learn from their mistakes, as long as they're willing to change." His words weren't meant just for Emma. They resonated throughout the room, a quiet call for reflection. Some diners lowered their heads, their own actions or inactions during the evening weighing on them. Others nodded subtly, acknowledging the truth in what he had said. Shaq resumed his meal with an air of calm, as though nothing had happened. But the atmosphere in the restaurant was far from normal. The lesson he had delivered lingered, heavy and profound. From a distance, Emma could still feel the eyes of everyone on her. Tonight would not simply fade into the background of her career. It would become a turning point, a moment she would carry with her forever. When Shaq finally rose from his seat, the room seemed to freeze. Every eye turned to him, the stillness broken only by the faint murmurs of the diners and the soft clinking of glasses. He swept his gaze across the room, his expression calm but resolute. "This restaurant was founded to welcome everyone," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "No matter what they look like or where they come from. That's the philosophy the founders, myself included, have always believed in." He paused, his eyes moving from one face to the next. "Unfortunately, tonight we failed to uphold that belief." The words struck like a gong, reverberating through the room. Some diners lowered their heads in shame, while others nodded in agreement. Mr. Carter set down his wine glass and shook his head. "He's right," he said softly. "We let this happen without saying a word." Lisa leaned forward, admiration evident in her eyes. "He's not just addressing the staff," she said. "He's speaking to all of us." Shaq continued, his tone imbued with sincerity. "The world we live in is riddled with prejudice. We judge people by their appearance, by the clothes they wear, by the way they speak, or by what we assume they have or don't have. But places like La Lumiere must be different. This is not just a place for the wealthy or the powerful. It is a place where everyone should feel welcome." His gaze rested on Emma once more, not with accusation but with a look of encouragement. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we learn from them." Emma's head remained lowered, his words cutting through the fog of regret clouding her mind. She knew he was right. Tonight had been a failure, but it didn't have to define her. Turning back to the staff, Shaq's voice softened but retained its strength. "La Lumiere is not just a restaurant," he said. "It's a place where we build relationships, not based on wealth or appearances, but on respect and understanding." If we forget that, we don't just fail ourselves. We fail the customers who trust us to be better." The staff listened intently, their expressions a mix of shame and resolve. Jake, one of the senior servers, nodded slightly, a newfound respect for Shaq evident in his demeanor. Shaq addressed the diners once more, his voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about the staff," he said. "It's about all of us. We all have a responsibility to create a better space. When you see someone being treated unfairly, you have the right, and I believe the responsibility, to speak up." Silence is complicity. The room erupted into applause, led by Lisa. The sound swelled, a testament to the impact of Shaq's words. Emma stood in the corner, tears welling in her eyes. She knew she had a long way to go, but for the first time that evening, she felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible, and tonight was just the beginning. Mr. Carter nodded in agreement, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. The applause swelled around him, a cascade of claps that carried a mix of respect and gratitude. A satisfied smile spread across his face, the kind that spoke volumes about his agreement with the principles just shared. Shaq raised his hand gently, the motion commanding an immediate and respectful silence. The room's energy shifted from celebratory to contemplative. He turned slowly to face Mr. Thompson, who stood nearby. Mr. Thompson's expression was a peculiar blend of worry and gratitude, as though he was simultaneously relieved and burdened by the gravity of the moment. "I believe we can do better," Shaq began, his voice a calm yet unyielding river of conviction. The resonance of his words filled the space, touching each soul present. "I'd like to meet with the entire staff after closing tonight. It's time for change." Mr. Thompson nodded, his demeanor shifting to one of utmost respect. "Of course, Shaq. I'm sorry for what happened tonight. We'll make it right." Shaq acknowledged the sentiment with a slight nod, then returned to his seat. As he resumed his meal, the powerful words that had left the entire restaurant in reflective silence seemed almost inconsequential to him. Yet, it was clear that no one in the room would forget the lessons imparted that evening. In a quiet corner, Emma sat frozen. The weight of shame pressed heavily on her shoulders, making it difficult to meet anyone's gaze. Beneath the overwhelming embarrassment, however, a new determination began to take root. It wasn't just about redeeming herself in the eyes of her colleagues or her boss. It was about becoming better, for herself, for her future, and for the values she now realized she had neglected. As the last diners exited the restaurant, Lumiere fell into an unusual and profound quiet. The soft hum of machinery in the kitchen and the faint clink of glassware being cleared were the only sounds that accompanied the gathering of staff in the main dining area. They formed a circle around Shaq, who stood at its center with an air of calm authority. The chandelier above cast a warm glow, its light reflecting on Shaq's face. It accentuated the seriousness in his expression as he surveyed the group. Mr. Thompson, the restaurant manager, stood nearby, his stance one of attentive support. Emma stood at the edge of the circle, her head bowed slightly, as though trying to shield herself from the piercing weight of Shaq's gaze. "Everyone makes mistakes," Shaq began, his deep voice steady and deliberate. Each word seemed to hang in the air, demanding attention and introspection. "But what matters is what we learn from them. Mistakes don't define us. How we correct them does." He paused, his eyes moving across the faces of the staff. Some nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in his words. Others remained still, their expressions solemn, as though absorbing the weight of his message for the first time. "This restaurant isn't just a place to eat," he continued, his voice unwavering. It's a place where people come to feel valued, to feel special. It is our responsibility to make sure that anyone who walks through those doors feels welcome. It doesn't matter how they're dressed, how they speak, or how much money they have in their wallets. Emma's heart clenched. Though Shaq spoke to everyone, his words seemed to be directed at her alone. She bit her lip, trying to keep the tears from spilling over. But the more she tried to compose herself, the harder it became to ignore the truth of his words. Shaq's gaze finally settled on Emma. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. There was no anger in his expression, only a stern resolve tempered by a glimmer of trust. Emma, he called her name, his tone softening but retaining its firmness. Today has been a tough day. Not just for you but for everyone here. But I want to hear from you. What do you think we should do to ensure this doesn't happen again? Emma's throat tightened. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, waiting for her response. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she finally lifted her gaze. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I'm sorry, Shaq, she began, tears welling in her eyes. I was wrong. I let my biases blind me, and I failed in my responsibilities. I truly regret it. Her voice cracked as she continued, but she pushed through. I didn't understand that respect isn't about how someone looks. I see that now, and I promise I'll change. Shaq nodded slightly, his expression softening further. That change is for you, Emma. Not for me, or anyone else. Change is a process, and I believe you can do it if you truly want to. Shaq's words weren't just for Emma. They reverberated throughout the room, touching everyone present. Heads nodded in silent agreement, and a few staff members exchanged glances, as though acknowledging their own need for introspection and growth. This restaurant, Shaq said, stepping closer to the center of the circle, is defined by how we treat each other and our guests. Respect and compassion are the foundation of everything we do. Without them, nothing else matters. The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't the stillness of discomfort but of contemplation, the kind that signaled a shift in understanding. Mr. Thompson broke the silence, his voice filled with gratitude. Shaq, thank you for your words. We'll ensure the team learns from this and becomes better. Lumiere will be a place where everyone feels welcome. That night, as the staff departed one by one, a sense of renewal filled the air. Emma lingered behind, her heart heavy but also lighter in a way she couldn't quite explain. She knew she had been given a second chance, and she was determined to honor it. Shaq stood at the doorway, watching as the lights of Lumiere dimmed. The restaurant was no longer just a dining space. It had become a place of growth, of transformation, and of hope. As Shaq walked away, the quiet streets of Beverly Hills seemed to echo the lessons of the evening. Change wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the small, consistent choices people made every day. Lumiere wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a beacon of respect, compassion, and the enduring power of kindness.